I'm Andrea. Standing in front of my own house, I stared at the changed locks in disbelief. It was as if someone had meticulously erased my right to enter the home where I'd lived for nearly a decade. In my one hand, I held a bag of groceries, and in the other, my useless keys that now seemed like a cruel joke. On the other side of the door, through the narrow gap allowed by the security chain, stood Ethan. His expression was something I'd never seen before on his face. It wasn't anger, it was something more unsettling, a look of self-assuredness as if he'd just accomplished something brilliant. "Mom figured it out," he said through the chain, sounding like he was announcing a major discovery. "That child isn't mine. She's way too smart for a simple guy like me." Beside me, my 8-year-old daughter Lily, in her pink raincoat and sparkly shoes, looked up at her father with a confused expression, like she couldn't decide if it was a bad joke. And then Ethan said, "Forget about child support. You two are on your own. Hit the road." Lily burst into laughter, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that made her bend at the waist. She was laughing because what she'd heard was so absurd that her body could only respond with laughter. She held onto my hand with both of hers for balance as she laughed. I wasn't laughing, and I wasn't crying either. In that moment, I was thinking with a clarity that felt both dangerous and liberating. Let me take you back to the beginning. 11 years ago, I met Ethan at a friend's art gallery opening. Everyone had gathered around the wine and cheese, and Ethan stood out. He was tall, with a quiet demeanor that seemed more thoughtful than shy. He spent most of the evening listening to others, and when he did listen, he gave you his full attention, as if every word you said was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. 3 years later, we got married in a small ceremony in my family's vineyard. My father walked me down the aisle between rows of grapevines. My mother was in tears throughout the whole event. Ethan's mother, Vera, wore a lavender dress and spent the reception introducing herself as the mother of the groom, emphasizing how she'd raised him to be the man he was. She said it at least 5 times, I counted. Vera was a woman who commanded a room. She was precise in her words, and her comments often seemed like compliments at first but turned out to be veiled criticisms. At the wedding, she told me I looked surprisingly well put together considering I'd planned the whole thing myself. She told my mother that the vineyard had a rustic charm. My mother later said Vera was a handful, and my father, a man of few words, said she was a project. But I told myself they were wrong. I thought Vera was just old-fashioned, a product of a different era, and that she'd eventually come to accept me. 2 years into our marriage, we bought a charming old cottage on a quiet country road. I fell in love with it at first sight. The way the morning sun filtered through the east windows, the creaking wooden floors, and the attic filled with old trunks and memories. Ethan was more practical. He liked the short commute to his job as a freelance graphic designer and the good local school district. The house was in my name because I had a better credit score and a more stable income from my job in marketing. It made sense for the mortgage to be in my name, and we discussed it briefly, thinking that was that. For years into our marriage, Lily was born on a stormy night in March. The hospital was in chaos because of the heavy rain, and Ethan had to be dropped off by his friend Jake because our car wouldn't start. When the nurse placed Lily in my arms, she looked up at me with such an intense and serious expression that I laughed. "She looks like she's already judging the world," Ethan said, and I laughed even harder. That was one of the last truly happy and uncomplicated moments we had as a family. The next morning, Vera came to the hospital. She stood in the doorway, holding a large bouquet of flowers, and stared at Lily for a long time. "She doesn't look like Ethan," she said. I told her that newborns rarely resembled anyone in particular, which was true. But she persisted, "No, I mean the coloring." I was exhausted, having just given birth and getting only a few hours of sleep, so I let it go and filed it away in my mind. Over the next 6 years, we managed to coexist with Vera. She came for Sunday dinners every few weeks, sat at the head of the table as if it was her right, and made various observations. She'd say that Lily was too independent for her age, which was a dig at my parenting. She'd comment that Ethan seemed tired, implying that I wasn't taking good care of him. Once, she said the house could use a professional interior designer, which was a criticism of everything. Ethan would deflect her comments with a small laugh, a change of subject, or a gentle pat on her shoulder. I later realized that he was managing her, not defending me. Lily was an observant child from the start. By the age of 6, she was reading at a 4th grade level. She was fascinated by astronomy and could explain the phases of the moon to anyone who would listen. By 8, she had a habit of asking thought-provoking questions like, why do some people have so much and others have so little? And is it still kind if you're nice to someone just to get something from them? About 8 months before that fateful day at the door, Vera came for Sunday dinner as usual. After dinner, while Ethan was doing the dishes, she asked to speak to me privately in the living room. She sat in my favorite armchair by the window and folded her hands in her lap, looking like she was about to deliver an important speech. I've been thinking about the practical arrangements in case something happens to you or Ethan, she said. I told her we had a will. She said she knew, but that she'd been talking to a financial advisor and that there were some issues with the current arrangement, especially regarding the house. She said it made her uncomfortable that the house was only in my name and thought it would be more fair to add Ethan to the title. She framed it as concern for her son and family stability, using the phrase "we're all in this together" twice. I told her the current arrangement was for practical reasons and that Ethan and I were fine with it. She looked at me with a neutral expression and then said, "Of course, I just wanted to bring it up." I told Ethan about the conversation that evening. He said his mother worried about things and that I shouldn't read too much into it. I wanted to believe him because I didn't want to think that Vera had a hidden agenda regarding our finances. 3 months later, I came home early from work with a migraine. I found Ethan at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a notebook full of figures beside it. When he saw me, he quickly closed the laptop, trying to make it look like he was just reaching for his coffee. I noticed but said nothing. I went upstairs, took some medicine for my migraine, and lay in the dark for a couple of hours, telling myself I was imagining things. One day in late August, I was in the backyard pruning the roses when I heard Ethan on the phone through the open kitchen window. His voice was low and careful. I heard him say, "She doesn't need to know the details. She just needs to sign." Then a pause, and "I know, Mom, I know. Just let me handle it." A cold clarity washed over me, but I didn't go inside right away. I finished pruning the roses methodically, taking my time. When I went inside, Ethan was making sandwiches, and the call was over. I asked him who he'd been talking to, and he said, "Jake, about a project next week." I just said, "Right," and smiled. I knew something was going on, but I needed to understand it fully before I said anything. After that, I started paying closer attention. Vera's visits became more frequent, and she began asking Lily questions like, "Do you look more like your mom or your dad?" And, "Do you know what it means to inherit something, sweetie?" Lily, being the smart girl she is, answered these questions diplomatically. "I look like myself," she said once, and Vera was taken aback and changed the subject. Ethan became quieter in those weeks. He wasn't cold or unkind, but he seemed subdued, as if he was carrying a heavy burden. He laughed less, spent less time at the dinner table, and went to bed earlier. 3 weeks before the day with the locks, I found a letter in Ethan's desk drawer while looking for the car insurance renewal. It was from a law firm in a nearby city that I didn't recognize. The letter confirmed a consultation about paternity declaration proceedings and property reclassification in case of a disputed parentage finding. It was dated 6 weeks prior. I felt a mix of cold and hot, and then a strange stillness. I put the letter back exactly as I found it and closed the drawer. I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the table, slowly realizing that something had been brewing behind my back. On that fateful Wednesday, I picked Lily up from school as usual. She talked about an argument in class about whether the Milky Way was the biggest galaxy. We stopped at the grocery store on the way home. When we turned onto our street, I noticed Vera's car parked crookedly in the driveway. I wasn't too alarmed because Vera had a key, which Ethan had given her without telling me a few months after we moved in. I parked behind her car, and Lily got out and took the lighter bag of groceries. We walked up the front path, and when I put my key in the deadbolt, it wouldn't turn. I tried again, but it was the same result. That's when I felt a sinking feeling in my chest. I tried the handle, and it was locked too. I knocked on the door, and after a pause, Ethan opened it a crack with the security chain on. That's when he said those words that changed everything. After he said Lily wasn't his and that we were on our own, I remained calm and said, "Ethan, open the door." There was a short pause, and then he opened the door. Vera was sitting in the living room, in my armchair, with a manila folder on her lap. She looked like a harmless old lady to anyone who didn't know her, but I knew she was the mastermind behind this. I asked, "What's in the folder, Vera?" She patted it and said, "A few things we thought you should see." Ethan and I took the folder. The first page was a printout of a DNA testing website, highlighting the paternity test section. The second page was a supposed test result with a paternity probability of 0%. But there was no laboratory name, no certification number, and no chain of custody documentation. I asked where it came from, and Vera said they'd sent in a hair sample from Lily's brush a few weeks ago. I looked at Ethan and asked if he knew about this. He shifted his weight and said his mother was concerned and that they thought it was better to know. I told them this wasn't a real test. Vera's expression didn't change, which told me I was right. I pointed out all the missing information on the document. She said it was from a licensed service, but when I asked her to give me the name on the spot, she took a long time to look it up on her phone. Finally, she named a website, and when I searched it on my phone, it turned out to be a novelty site that sold fun DNA certificates for $24, not scientifically valid or legally binding. Vera then said that she knew Lily wasn't her grandchild and that she didn't look or act like Ethan. I told her that Lily was exactly like me, with my father's eyes and my mother's intelligence. I asked her the real reason behind all this. She then said, "I want to discuss the house." I knew it was coming. I'd suspected it since that conversation about the will and the phone call I overheard. She said Ethan had lived in the house for 7 years and contributed to the household, but his name wasn't on the deed, which wasn't fair. I realized that the paternity test was just a ploy to reclassify our marriage and challenge the property title. I asked Ethan if he knew about this plan. He said he knew his mother was talking to someone, but he didn't know all the details. I asked if he actually believed Lily wasn't his, and he said no. I made it clear to both of them that this was my house, with my name on the deed, mortgage, and tax documents for 7 years. Changing the locks was a legal entry and could be considered criminal trespass. I took the folder upstairs, called my father, a retired lawyer, and then called my father's former colleague, Denise, a property law expert. Denise told me to send her photos of the document and not let anyone remove anything from the house. I did as she said and then went back downstairs. I told Ethan and Vera that if they restored the locks, surrendered the document, and stopped this legal strategy, we could talk. Otherwise, I'd file a civil complaint. The locksmith came at 6:30. Vera left without a word, and Ethan slept in the study that night. The next morning, Ethan told me that Vera had been planning this for a long time, and the paternity idea wasn't even hers originally. He said he knew in October but kept hoping she'd drop it. I asked him why he didn't tell me, and he said because it would make it real, and he'd have to make a decision. I told him to decide now whether he'd support his mother's actions or help me stop them. He asked for Denise's number and called her. After the call, he said she wanted to meet the next day. Denise moved quickly. Within 72 hours, she filed a declaratory judgment reaffirming my sole title, a civil complaint for unlawful lockout against Ethan and Vera, and a cease and desist to the law firm involved. The firm withdrew within 24 hours, and the civil complaint was settled 6 weeks later. Vera acknowledged in writing that the property was solely mine, and the fabricated document was entered into the record as evidence of bad faith. Ethan and I separated 8 months later. It wasn't just because of what he'd done, but because I finally saw the parallel allegiance he'd maintained with his mother over the years. We told Lily about the separation on a Sunday in November. She asked if we'd still live in the house, and I said yes. She also asked if her dad would still come for dinner sometimes, and Ethan said yes. It's been 14 months now. The house is still the same, with its creaking floors and the smell of old books in the attic. Lily has moved on from astronomy to geology and is now obsessed with rocks and fossils. Ethan comes on Wednesdays and every other weekend. He's started therapy, and we're civil to each other. I haven't seen Vera, and I don't expect to. Sitting on the porch in the early spring light, I know that this house is mine, not just because of the deed but because of the life I've built here with Lily. Some things can't be taken away by a fake test or a changed lock.